Have you ever wondered why sexual desire feels so much bigger than the body, as if something ancient, sacred, and uncontrollable awakens inside you? Why a simple attraction can shake your entire being, even when you try to resist it? Carl Jung believed that what we call desire is not just biology, it is the voice of the unconscious, a rehearsal for something far greater. Behind every pulse of longing, there is a message from the spiritual world, testing how much control you truly have over yourself. Desire doesn't just want to be satisfied, it wants to reveal. It exposes the truth about your hidden fears, your hunger for connection, and your resistance to surrender. Every temptation you face is a mirror between your human nature and your divine potential. What if the energy you call lust is actually your soul, remembering what it once was and what it's trying to become again? Stay until the end of this video, because once you understand what your sexual desire really means, you will never look at it the same way again. There is a moment that happens to everyone, though most never talk about it. You're going about your day, calm and composed, when suddenly something shifts. A glance, a scent, a voice. And without permission, your entire body responds. Your heart races, your skin awakens. A heat rises from somewhere deep inside that you cannot name or control. Your mind tries to intervene, tries to rationalize, tries to suppress what is happening. But the body does not listen. It speaks a language older than thought itself. Carl Jung understood this better than most. He knew that beneath the surface of our civilized minds lives an ancient intelligence that does not care about logic, morality, or social expectations. This intelligence communicates through symbols, through dreams, and most powerfully, through the body's raw responses to the world. When sexual desire strikes, it is not random, it is not merely chemical. It is the unconscious sending you a message written in the oldest alphabet known to humanity. Think about how strange this really is. You can be completely uninterested in someone intellectually. You might even dislike their personality or disagree with their values. Yet your body reacts as if it recognizes something your conscious mind refuses to see. This is not a malfunction. This is your deeper self trying to show you a truth that lives beyond words. The body knows things the mind has forgotten. It remembers connections that civilization taught you to ignore. Jung called this the wisdom of the instincts. He believed that sexual energy, what he termed libido, was not just about reproduction or pleasure. It was life force itself, the raw creative power that moves through everything living. When you feel desire, you are feeling the universe's will to create, to merge, to transform. Your body becomes a vessel for something far greater than personal want. It becomes a channel for the divine impulse that keeps existence itself moving forward. But here is where it gets truly fascinating. The specific way your body responds reveals the unique shape of your soul's longing. Not everyone desires the same things or the same people. What awakens you sexually is a map to your psychological needs, your unhealed wounds, your forgotten wholeness. If you pay attention, if you listen without judgment, your desire will teach you who you really are beneath all the masks you wear. Most people spend their lives fighting this language. They feel ashamed when their body reacts in ways their mind disapproves of. They try to control every impulse, every attraction, every fantasy. But Jung warned that this war between conscious and unconscious always ends badly. When you reject the body's wisdom, you do not eliminate desire. You only drive it underground, where it grows twisted and distorted in the darkness. It comes back as compulsion, as obsession, as behavior you cannot understand or control. The body does not speak in sentences. It speaks in sensations, in images, in sudden overwhelming feelings that bypass reason entirely. This is why sexual desire can feel so frightening. It reminds you that you are not fully in control. It shows you that beneath your carefully constructed identity lives something wild, something that refuses to be tamed by willpower alone. This wildness is not your enemy. It is your connection to the sacred ground of being itself. When you feel pulled toward another person, your body is not just seeking physical satisfaction, it is seeking completion of something that feels missing inside you. Jung discovered that we project our unconscious opposite onto others. A man projects his inner feminine, what Jung called the anima. A woman projects her inner masculine, the animus. Sexual attraction is the soul's attempt to reunite with its lost half, to become whole again through another person. Of course, no actual person can fulfill this projection completely, but the pull you feel is real. It is your psyche trying to heal itself, trying to integrate what has been split apart. This explains why desire can feel so irrational, so all-consuming. You are not just wanting another body, you are wanting to recover a piece of yourself that you have lost. The intensity you feel is proportional to how much of yourself you have disowned. The stronger the attraction, the more your unconscious is trying to show you something crucial about your own hidden nature. Your body speaks this language constantly. Every flutter of attraction, every moment of arousal, every fantasy that appears unbidden in your mind, these are all messages from the depths. They are not random, they are not meaningless. They are the unconscious trying to communicate with you in the only language it knows, the language of image, emotion, and bodily sensation. When you learn to listen without fear, without shame, without the need to immediately act or suppress, you begin to hear what your soul has been trying to tell you all along. Now, we come to the dangerous territory that most people spend their entire lives avoiding, because once you start listening to what your body is saying, once you begin to acknowledge the desires that move through you, you encounter something even more unsettling. You discover that much of what you feel contradicts who you believe yourself to be. This contradiction, this gap between your conscious identity and your actual desires, is what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is everything you have decided you are not. It contains all the qualities, impulses, and characteristics that you have rejected because they did not fit the image you wanted to maintain. For most people, sexual desire is deeply entangled with shadow material. You want things you think you should not want. You feel attracted to qualities you consciously despise. You have fantasies that horrify your waking mind. And so you push these feelings down, lock them away, pretend they do not exist. But here is the truth that Jung discovered through decades of working with the human psyche. What you deny does not disappear. It grows stronger in the darkness. Every time you refuse to acknowledge a desire, every time you shame yourself for feeling what you feel, you are feeding the shadow. You are giving it power over you. The energy you use to suppress these feelings does not vanish. It gets absorbed into the unconscious, where it begins to operate autonomously, outside your awareness or control. This is why people often find themselves doing the very things they swore they would never do. The religious leader who preaches against lust but cannot stop visiting prostitutes. The person who judges others for their sexuality while secretly consumed by the same desires. The one who builds an entire identity around purity while their inner world churns with forbidden fantasies. These are not hypocrites in the simple sense. These are people who have fed their shadow so much denied energy that it has become powerful enough to take control when consciousness weakens. Jung was clear about this. You cannot eliminate the shadow. You can only choose whether to acknowledge it consciously or let it possess you unconsciously. When you deny what you feel, you give those feelings autonomous power. They begin to act through you without your awareness. You become a puppet to the very desires you thought you had conquered. The monk who has beaten down his sexuality through discipline may find himself more obsessed with sex than someone who accepts their desires naturally. The suppression creates the obsession. Think about the sheer amount of energy humans waste, trying to pretend they do not feel what they feel. Entire religious systems built around sexual denial. Social structures designed to shame natural impulses. Personal identities constructed on rejecting desire. All of this effort, and what does it produce? Not liberation, not peace. It produces a shadow that grows more monstrous the more it is starved of acknowledgement. It produces a split psyche, where one hand does not know what the other is doing. The shadow feeds on denial the way fire feeds on oxygen. Every judgment you make about your own desires makes the shadow stronger. Every moment you tell yourself that what you feel is wrong, dirty, or unacceptable, you push more of your life energy into the realm of the unconscious. And there it waits, accumulating power, until the moment your conscious control slips. Then it erupts in ways you never intended, in behaviors you cannot explain, in compulsions that feel alien to who you think you are. But there is another way. Jung taught that the path to wholeness requires befriending the shadow, not destroying it. This does not mean acting on every impulse. It means acknowledging what lives inside you without judgment. It means looking at your desires, even the ones that disturb you, with curiosity rather than condemnation. When you can say, yes, this feeling exists in me, and I can examine it without becoming it, you begin to reclaim the energy trapped in the shadow. This is where most people misunderstand the work. They think acknowledging desire means indulging it. They confuse acceptance with action, but Jung's approach was far more subtle. He understood that when you truly see something in yourself, when you bring it into the light of consciousness, it loses its compulsive power. The fantasy that controls you when hidden becomes just a fantasy when acknowledged. The desire that haunts you in denial becomes manageable when admitted. By the way, if you're curious to go even deeper and integrate your shadows and light, check out the Sim Method ebook. It's a concise guide that can help you unlock your inner power in just 5 minutes a day. The link is in the first pinned comment below. Have you ever locked eyes with a stranger and felt an impossible familiarity? As if you have known this person your entire life, even though you are meeting them for the first time. There is a recognition that happens in certain encounters, a feeling so strong it can alter the course of your life in a single moment. Your rational mind knows nothing about this person. You have no shared history, no logical reason to feel connected. Yet something deeper than memory stirs, something ancient awakens. And suddenly you are pulled toward them with a force that feels like destiny itself. Jung spent years trying to understand this phenomenon. He worked with countless people who described falling into immediate, overwhelming attraction with someone they barely knew. These were not shallow infatuations. These were soul-shaking experiences that felt more real than ordinary reality. What he discovered changed how we understand human connection forever. That feeling of recognition is not an illusion. You are recognizing something, but what you are seeing is not the actual person in front of you. You are seeing a reflection of your own unconscious. This is the magic and the tragedy of projection. When you meet someone who awakens intense desire, what you are actually encountering is your own inner opposite. Jung called these inner figures the anima and animus. Every man carries within him an unconscious feminine essence. Every woman carries an unconscious masculine essence. These are not just concepts, they are living psychological realities, complete personalities that exist in the depths of your psyche. And they are desperate to be recognized, to be brought into consciousness, to be integrated into your whole self. But you cannot see your own unconscious directly. It is, by definition, hidden from your awareness. So the psyche does something brilliant and dangerous. It projects these inner figures onto people in the external world. When you meet someone who matches the image of your anima or animus, your unconscious lights up with recognition. Finally, here is the missing piece. Finally, here is what has been sought. The intensity you feel is not about the other person at all. It is about your own soul trying to become whole. This explains why attraction can feel so irrational and overwhelming. You might meet someone who is completely wrong for you by every practical measure. Different values, incompatible lifestyles, obvious red flags everywhere, yet you cannot stop thinking about them. You feel drawn as if by invisible threads. Your friends cannot understand it. You cannot understand it yourself. But your unconscious does not care about compatibility or practicality. It cares only about psychological completion. It has found an image of what you lack, and it will move heaven and earth to unite with it. The tragedy is that most people spend their lives chasing these projections without ever understanding what is really happening. They fall in love with their own anima or animus reflected in another person. They believe this other person holds the key to their happiness, their completion, their salvation, and for a while, the magic works. The relationship feels transcendent, fated, unlike anything experienced before. But eventually, reality intrudes. The real person behind the projection reveals themselves, and they are just human, flawed, and limited like everyone else. The projection collapses. The magic dies. And the seeker moves on to the next person who can carry the projection, repeating the pattern endlessly. Jung saw this cycle play out in therapy again and again. People destroying their lives chasing projections, leaving marriages, abandoning children, sacrificing everything for a feeling of recognition that they did not understand. He knew that the only way to break this cycle was to withdraw the projection, to recognize that what you are seeking in another person actually lives inside you. The qualities that attract you so powerfully are your own disowned qualities. The feminine wisdom you seek in a woman is your own anima trying to speak. The masculine strength you desire in a man is your own animus demanding acknowledgement. But here is what makes this so difficult. Withdrawing projection feels like death. When you realize that the person you have been obsessing over is not actually the carrier of your salvation, when you understand that you have been in love with your own reflection, something breaks. The world loses its enchantment. That special person becomes ordinary. The meaning you built around the relationship crumbles. This is why most people refuse to do this work. They would rather chase projections forever than face the emptiness that comes when illusions fall away. Yet on the other side of this death is something far more valuable than projection. When you stop seeking your wholeness in another person, you can begin the real work of integration. You can turn inward and meet your anima or animus directly. You can enter into relationship with these inner figures through dreams, through imagination, through the difficult work of self-examination, and slowly, painfully, you can reclaim the qualities you have been projecting outward. The feminine wisdom becomes yours. The masculine strength becomes yours. You become whole within yourself. This does not mean you stop desiring others. It does not mean relationships become meaningless. But the quality of desire changes completely. Instead of desperate need, there is appreciation. Instead of seeking completion, there is the joy of meeting another whole person. You can love without the crushing weight of projection. You can desire without losing yourself. You can recognize beauty in another without believing they hold your missing pieces. For thousands of years, organized religion has waged war against sexual desire. Priests and prophets declared the body evil, passion sinful, pleasure a trap that leads souls to damnation. They built vast systems of guilt and shame around the most natural human experiences. They taught people to fear their own flesh, to view desire as the enemy of the spirit, to believe that holiness requires the death of everything sensual and alive. And millions of people internalize these teachings, spending their lives trying to extinguish the fire that burns at the core of their being. But Jung understood something that the religious authorities either forgot or deliberately obscured. The energy they called sinful is the same energy that mystics call divine. Sexual desire and spiritual longing are not opposites. They are two expressions of the same fundamental force. The fire that moves through your body when you feel attraction is the same fire that saints describe when they speak of union with God. The longing for merger, for transcendence of boundaries, for losing yourself in something greater, this is identical whether directed toward another person or toward the infinite. Every mystical tradition knows this secret, even if their official doctrine denies it. The Christian mystics wrote of their love for God in language so erotic it scandalized the Church. Saint Teresa described her spiritual experiences in terms of penetration and ecstasy. Saint John of the Cross wrote love poems to the divine that read like letters to a forbidden lover. The Sufi poets were even more explicit, singing of wine and intoxication, of the beloved's embrace, of dying into union. They understood that the vocabulary of sexual love is the only human language powerful enough to describe the soul's relationship with the sacred. This is because both experiences involve the same psychological process. In sexual desire, the ego's boundaries dissolve. You want to merge with another, to lose yourself, to die into something larger than your separate self. In spiritual longing, the exact same dissolution occurs. The ego that insists on its own importance, its own separateness, must die for union to happen. Whether you are surrendering to another person or surrendering to God makes no difference to the psyche. The mechanism is identical. The fear is identical. The ecstasy is identical. Religion tried to split these two fires apart because desire threatened institutional control. A person who trusts their own body's wisdom does not need priests to tell them what is sacred. A person who has experienced the divine through erotic union does not need churches or temples, so the authorities declared war on the body, tried to convince humanity that spirit and flesh are enemies, that you must choose between earthly love and heavenly love. This split created immense suffering. It created people who could not enjoy physical intimacy because they felt guilty. It created spiritual seekers who starved their bodies and hated their desires. It created a civilization at war with itself. Jung saw the damage this split caused in every patient he treated, people torn between what they were taught to believe and what they actually felt, people who experienced sexual pleasure and then drowned in shame. People who denied their desires so completely they became numb to all feeling, spiritual and physical alike. He understood that healing required reuniting what religion had torn asunder. The sacred and the sexual are not enemies. They are partners in the great work of transformation. Think about what happens in moments of true passion. Time stops. The ordinary world falls away. You exist in a space outside normal consciousness, where nothing matters except the connection happening right now. This is not degradation. This is transcendence. This is the ego's grip loosening, allowing something larger to move through you. The body becomes a temple. The other person becomes divine. And for a brief window, you experience the unity that mystics spend lifetimes seeking through prayer and meditation. Of course, this frightens people. Especially it frightens those who have built their identity around control, around righteousness, around being above the mess of human desire. They cannot admit that the very thing they have judged as base and animal might actually be a doorway to the divine. So they double down on repression, on shame, on the doctrine that says the body must be conquered for the spirit to be free. And they create more shadow, more splitting, more psychological damage that requires generations to heal. But there have always been those who understood differently, the tantric practitioners who made sexuality itself a spiritual practice. The sacred prostitutes of ancient temples who served as bridges between human and divine. The alchemists who spoke of the union of opposites, the marriage of masculine and feminine, as the key to creating gold from lead. These traditions recognized that sexual energy is not opposed to spiritual development. It is the fuel for spiritual development. It is the raw power that, when consciously directed, can transform consciousness itself. Everyone has a secret world that no one else sees. A private theater, where scenarios play out that would shock the people who know you best. These are your fantasies, the stories your mind creates when no one is watching, the desires that emerge unbidden in quiet moments or dreams. Most people feel ashamed of this inner world. They believe their fantasies reveal something broken or perverse about them. They try to suppress these images, to think of something else, to pretend they do not have the thoughts they clearly have. But Jung would tell you something radical. Your fantasies are not problems to be solved. They are messages to be decoded. Every fantasy contains a symbolic truth about your psyche. The images that arouse you, the scenarios that captivate you, the dynamics that appear again and again in your imagination, these are not random. They are carefully constructed symbols created by your unconscious to communicate what cannot be said directly. Your fantasies speak in the language of metaphor and archetype, using sexual imagery to represent psychological needs, unresolved conflicts, and potentials trying to emerge into consciousness. This is difficult for most people to accept because we have been taught to take fantasies literally. If you fantasize about domination, society tells you this means you want to dominate or be dominated in real life. If you imagine scenarios that would be unethical or impossible in reality, you're taught to feel guilty, as if having the thought is the same as doing the deed. But Jung understood that the unconscious does not work this way. It does not communicate literal desires. It communicates through symbols that must be interpreted, not enacted. Consider someone who repeatedly fantasizes about submission, about being controlled or overpowered by another. The conventional interpretation says this person wants to be dominated sexually, but Jung would look deeper. What does submission represent psychologically? It represents surrender of ego control. It represents allowing something other than conscious will to take over. For someone who spends their waking life being responsible, in control, making decisions for everyone else, the fantasy of submission is the psyche's way of saying, you need to let go. You need to stop trying to control everything. You need to surrender to forces larger than your conscious intention. The fantasy is not asking to be acted out literally. It is asking for integration of what it symbolizes. The person needs to find ways in their actual life to surrender control appropriately, to trust, to allow vulnerability, to stop carrying everything alone. The sexual imagery is simply the most powerful language the unconscious has to communicate this need. Sex gets your attention in a way that abstract concepts cannot. The fantasy is doing its job perfectly when it disturbs you enough to make you think, to question, to look deeper at what is really being asked. Or take the opposite pattern. Someone who fantasizes about power, about control, about others submitting to their will. The surface interpretation says they are domineering or aggressive. But symbolically, this fantasy often appears in people who feel powerless in their actual lives. People who cannot speak their truth, who let others walk over them, who have no agency in their own existence. The fantasy of dominance is the psyche's compensation, its way of asserting what has been denied. It says, you have power, you have will, you have the right to take up space and make things happen. Again, the point is not to go out and dominate others. The point is to recognize the legitimate need for agency and find appropriate ways to express it. The more extreme or disturbing the fantasy, the more important the message usually is. People who have fantasies that horrify them are often the ones most desperately in need of what those fantasies symbolize. The unconscious uses shock value to get past the ego's defenses. If it whispered quietly, you would ignore it. So it shouts in the most disturbing imagery possible, forcing you to pay attention. This does not make you a bad person. This makes you someone whose psyche is working overtime to communicate something your conscious mind refuses to hear. Jung worked with many people whose fantasy lives seemed completely at odds with their conscious values. The gentle, peaceful person who fantasized about violence, the feminist who imagined scenarios of degradation, the morally upright citizen who dreamed of transgression. In every case, he found that the fantasy represented a disowned part of the personality trying to get recognized. The gentle person had never learned to access healthy aggression and boundary setting. The feminist had rejected her own receptivity in her fight for equality. The moral citizen had never allowed himself spontaneity or freedom from rules. The fantasy is not the problem. The problem is the split between conscious identity and unconscious reality. When you have built your life around being only one thing, the psyche will use fantasy to keep the other possibilities alive. It will create scenarios that embody everything you have rejected. And these scenarios will be compelling precisely because they represent what you most need to integrate. The energy behind the fantasy is proportional to how much you have denied that quality in your waking life. This is why trying to eliminate fantasies through willpower never works. You cannot suppress the unconscious. You can only drive it deeper underground. The person who fights their fantasies, who feels guilty about them, who tries desperately to think pure thoughts, only gives those fantasies more power. They become intrusive, obsessive, harder to ignore. The psyche increases the volume when you refuse to listen. It will not be silenced because the message is too important. The path Jung offered is entirely different. Instead of fighting your fantasies, study them. Instead of feeling ashamed, get curious. Ask what each image represents symbolically. What quality or capacity is trying to emerge? What aspect of yourself have you rejected that wants recognition? What does your psyche need that your conscious life is not providing? When you approach fantasies as symbolic communications rather than literal desires, they lose their compulsive quality. You can learn from them without being controlled by them. And here is the beautiful paradox Jung discovered. When you truly integrate what a fantasy represents, the fantasy itself often fades. Once you have found appropriate ways to express the disowned quality, once you have reclaimed the projected energy, the unconscious no longer needs to shout so loudly. The fantasy served its purpose. It got your attention. It forced you to see what you were missing. Once the message is received and acted upon, the messenger can rest. So now you know the truth that changes everything. Your sexual desire was never the enemy. It was never something to conquer or something to surrender to blindly. It was always a messenger, a guide, a voice from the depths, trying to show you who you really are beneath all the masks and defenses. Every attraction that shook you, every fantasy that disturbed you, every moment of longing that felt too big to contain, they were all breadcrumbs leading you back to yourself. Jung understood what most will never see, that the fire burning in your body is the same fire that creates galaxies, that transforms lead into gold, that turns the unconscious into consciousness. The question was never whether you would feel desire. The question was always whether you would be brave enough to listen to what it was really saying. Because once you understand that your sexuality is not separate from your spirituality, that your body is not the prison of your soul, but its most honest voice, you can never unsee it. You will walk through the world differently. You will love differently. You will know yourself differently. And that terrifies most people more than staying asleep forever. So tell me, now that you see it, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you go back to pretending desire is just biology? Or will you finally acknowledge that what moves through you is sacred, ancient, and absolutely determined to wake you up?